You've landed right back at Ritualistically Botanica. If you're new here, my name is Mo and I'm your host. This is where I explore an assortment of metaphysical, mystical, and divinatory subjects. My particular loves are astrology, tarot, herbs, and books. And today, I'm talking about books. I've become fascinated with the period stretching roughly from 1840 to about 1917, when there seemed to be an explosion of writers exploring new ideas about the mind, human consciousness, spirituality, and the world that might be coming. Now, some belonged to what became known as the New Thought movement. Others wrote speculative fiction, strange little political nightmares, or stories that appear to have been pulled out of the future by someone who should not have had access to the internet. But there's a thread running through them. And before we get into today's book, I want to mention something that may help explain why these old writers have captured my attention. Different civilizations have understood time as cyclical. The Egyptians explored it, the Greeks explored it. Indian traditions describe vast repeating ages. And more recently, a book called The Fourth Turning proposed that societies move through reoccurring historical patterns. These are not all the same system, but they share an interesting idea. History may move in cycles rather than in the straight, tidy lines we think it does. The interpretation of the Indian Yuga cycle describes humanity moving from an age focused primarily on matter into a greater understanding of energy, followed by deeper understanding of thought, and eventually spirit. Now, I'm not going to unpack all of that today because that's another conversation and possibly a small existential crisis. Just keep the idea somewhere in the back of your mind. What if human beings move through cycles in which knowledge rises, disappears, and slowly reemerges? What if some of these 19th century writers were sensing a shift before they had the language to fully explain it? That question is part of what inspired this series that I am calling Dead Authors and Living Ideas. The authors may be dead, but their ideas are still out here, wandering around without supervision. I started this as a passion project, but the deeper I go, the more I feel there's another reason to do it. We're living in a time when real books, sustained reading, and critical thinking can feel like endangered species. Everything is condensed, summarized, clipped, scrolled past, and handed back to us in pre-digested pieces. I want us to go back to the books, not because every old author had the answers. Some of them most certainly did not. But reading, questioning, comparing ideas, and deciding what we think for ourselves are skills worth protecting. That's why I'm organizing these videos on my YouTube channel under the playlist Dead Authors, Living Ideas. We've already explored Ingersoll Lockwood's strange adventures of young Baron Trump. We've also looked at Edward Page Mitchell, the author of The Crystal Man, who wrote anonymously for The Sun and eventually became an editor of the newspaper. And today we're returning to Ingersoll Lockwood for another peculiar little book, 1900, or The Last President. Now, I'm not suggesting Lockwood predicted Donald Trump or somehow downloaded tomorrow's headlines through a Victorian crystal ball. What interests me is something more unsettling. When we look back at the fears, political upheavals, and public behavior described in this book, we begin to recognize things we're experiencing now. Not because the events are identical, because the pattern is familiar, and sometimes the winky little coinky-dinks are familiar enough to make you stop, look around, and say, well, that's a little fucking uncomfortable, so let's open the book and see what Ingersoll Lockwood thought might happen when an election went sideways and an entire country began losing its Victorian mind. It opens on Tuesday, November 3rd, 1896, election night. And according to Ingersoll Lockwood, America has just elected William Jennings Bryan president. Now, before we get tangled in the first historical pothole, Bryan did not actually win that election. William McKinley did. Lockwood imagined what might happen if Bryan had won instead. And apparently, in his imagination, the answer was everybody immediately loses their shit. New York City hears the election results and reacts as though someone announced the apocalypse would be arriving before breakfast. Police order residents indoors, businesses shut down, lights go out across the city, and an angry crowd begins moving up Fifth Avenue, threatening wealthy elites and demanding that the old political order be torn apart. Fifth Avenue, interesting choice, especially considering the same author had already written books about a young fella named Barron Trump. Now let me be clear, the building mentioned in the book is the Fifth Avenue Hotel. It's not Trump Tower. Trump Tower did not exist. But the author of Barron Trump did place political unrest on Fifth Avenue. So that is our first little winky coinky-dink. Nothing alarming, just a Victorian gentleman casually arranging suspicious furniture for the 21st century. The situation gets worse. Troops fire into the crowd, bodies are carried away. One horrified official looks at the destruction and begins to say, "Aye, but the Republic." Then he stops. He doesn't finish the sentence. Even the punctuation has decided it's time to leave the country. And here's the pattern. An election is no longer simply an election. It becomes a final battle between people who believe they are saving the country and people they believe are destroying it. The other side isn't merely wrong, the other side is evil. Sound familiar? Well, hold on to your eyebrows. We're just getting started. While New York is panicking, Chicago is celebrating. Lockwood describes the supporters as an orderly mob, which is a little like calling a tornado organized because it lined up the lawn furniture before throwing it through the window. The new president and a mysterious political figure referred to as the Master are treated almost like saviors. Supporters invoke George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and even Jesus driving the money changers from the temple, because nothing says stable government like deciding your preferred politician is a combination of founding father, religious messiah, and customer service manager for the apocalypse. 4 federal soldiers are killed. The celebration continues. Apparently nobody wanted a little homicide interfering with the parade, and there's our next familiar pattern. Politics becomes religion. The leader becomes deliverance, the opposition becomes demonic, and suddenly everyone has a hat. Meanwhile, Wall Street receives the news and has what can only be described as a complete Victorian nervous breakdown. Men are shouting, men are fainting, ambulances are arriving. It's basically CNBC in corsets. Why? Because Bryan supports expanding the use of silver as money, and Lockwood believes this will destroy the financial system. Now, I'm not going to drag us into a 19th century economics lecture. Nobody came here hoping to spend 20 minutes discussing the gold standard. The important thing is that people are promised this new silver policy will make them richer, and some of them take that very literally. Traveling salesmen convince ordinary Americans that they can bring their household silver to Washington and have it transformed into something far more valuable. So people begin arriving with cups, forks, serving trays, and grandma's gravy ladle. You can practically hear somebody saying, "Trust me, this spoon is going to the moon." Unfortunately, much of the silver is plated junk, which means that long before cryptocurrency, meme stocks, or a stranger online promising financial freedom by Thursday, Americans were already surrendering their common sense to a man with confidence in a sales pitch. Different century, same bullshit. Then comes Inauguration Day. The sky is so dark that Lockwood calls it the dawnless day, because apparently even the weather read the manuscript and thought, oh, this is going to be a disaster. The president announces his cabinet, and here comes a little winky coinky-dink that has kept the internet busy for years. His Secretary of Agriculture is named Pence. Yes, Pence, P-E-N-C-E. Now breathe. His name is Lafe Pence. He was a real politician from Colorado. He is not Mike Pence. He is not the vice president. He is the Secretary of Agriculture, which means that while the internet is desperately trying to place him at the Capitol, certifying an election, this man is somewhere worrying about turnips. But still, a book written by the author of Barron Trump describing a disastrous presidency includes a government official named Pence. I'm not saying it means anything. I'm just saying the coincidence walked in wearing perfume and everybody noticed. The new president immediately begins changing policy through executive orders. One man, one pen. No, it wasn't an auto pen. The promise that the old system is about to be turned upside down. Wall Street faints again. At this point, somebody really should have passed out smelling salts and electrolytes. Meanwhile, thousands of supporters descend on Washington expecting jobs, higher wages, and the beautiful new world they were promised. In the beautiful new bill, just saying, that's just me. There I go. They discover that the government cannot deliver quite as much as the campaign suggested. Imagine that. The administration eventually feeds many of them and sends them home. The revolution, it turns out, has limited seating and absolutely no vacancies. Congress starts rearranging the rules. Government positions change hands. Institutions are reshaped. Loyalists gain influence. And the president declares, "We are the people," which sounds wonderful until you realize it usually means the rest of you are decorative. Then the financial experiment begins falling apart. Money loses value. People carry coins around in baskets. Payments arrive in sacks. Eventually, the currency becomes so undesirable that even thieves aren't particularly interested. Now, Lockwood was not writing neutral economic analysis. He favored the gold standard, and he was deliberately imagining the worst possible outcome. This book is essentially a political attack advertisement dressed in Victorian mourning clothes. But the psychological pattern is interesting. Promise people certainty, tell them someone else caused all their problems, convince them salvation is just one election away, then act astonished when the entire room catches fire. By 1899, the country is broke, furious, and increasingly violent, and the president realizes he can no longer control the forces he helped unleash. Lockwood gives him one of the most revealing lines in the entire book. "The spirits I have called up are no longer obedient to me." That is the whole story right there. A leader believes he is directing the movement, then he discovers the movement is directing him. Because once you feed people outrage for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you cannot suddenly announce that everyone is switching to a healthy little salad of compromise. The rage develops a life of its own. Congress begins fighting over pensions for former Confederate soldiers. And when I say fighting, I do not mean sending passive-aggressive emails. Knives appears, pistols are drawn. It's C-SPAN with Bowie knives. People begin discussing whether the country should split into separate republics. Yes. Sound familiar? National divorce had entered the conversation before cable news, social media, or the existence of a group chat you could quietly mute. Then we arrive at the final night of the century, December 31st of 1899. Congress is trapped in a bitter, chaotic session. Politicians from the South begin singing hymns. Their opponents answer with John Brown's Body. The United States government has officially become a hostile choir rehearsal. The president arrives and tries to speak. The speaker shuts him down. The clock strikes midnight, and the Capitol dome explodes. Yes, the Capitol explodes. The legislative chamber survives. The disputed bill passes. The president is led away. Bells ring in the new century while Lockwood announces that the Republic of Washington is dead. America has apparently expired from parliamentary procedure with a dynamite chaser. And now, of course, we have to address the rather large coinky-dink standing in the middle of the room. No, this is not a literal prediction of January 6th. There is no Donald Trump in the book. There is no Mike Pence. There is no horned fellow wandering through the Capitol dressed like a politically confused Viking. Lafe Pence is still over at agriculture trying to protect the rutabagas. But look at the pattern. Election becomes an existential crisis. Political opponents are treated as enemies. Institutions are accused of betraying the people. The country begins talking about breaking apart. And violence eventually reaches the Capitol. That's not a prophecy, but it is a resemblance wearing an indecent amount of eyeliner. Ingersoll Lockwood was born in New York in 1841. He became a lawyer, served as an American consul during Abraham Lincoln's administration, and wrote the Barron Trump Adventures before publishing The Last President in 1896. He lived to 77. And no, I don't think he was sitting in a Victorian parlor secretly downloading future headlines through a crystal ball. I think he was watching the tensions of his own time and imagining where they might lead. We should also be honest that the book reflects some ugly prejudices of its era. There are racists and pacifist elements we don't need to ignore or excuse. You can recognize that, and Arthur saw a pattern without pretending he saw everything clearly. And that brings us back to the idea we started with, cycles. Lockwood's world was wrestling with political upheaval, economic anxiety, distrust of institutions, and competing visions of what the country should become. Our world is wrestling with many of the same things, except this nightmare moved at the speed of newspapers and railroads. Ours has Wi-Fi, a passport, and absolutely no respect for borders. Today, fear can travel around the world before breakfast. So what are we supposed to make of all these strange little connections? The Fifth Avenue unrest, the name Pence, the collapsing government, the fractured country, the violence at the Capitol, and the fact that the whole thing was written by the same man who gave us Barron Trump. Maybe there are no coincidences. Maybe they reveal that human beings keep returning to the same patterns whenever fear, power, and uncertainty collide. Or maybe the past has been standing in the doorway this entire time, clearing its throat, waiting for us to notice. Either way, those are some very enthusiastic winky coinky-dinks. This is Dead Arthur's Living Ideas with Ritualistically Mo. And my dear, history may not repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. That's it. That's all I got for you. Bye now.